Again, this is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. We have with us at WZRD Chicago via Zoom, Fidel Arroyo Jr. of CORE, and that is again the community out. So he is the Community Outreach Research and Planning Specialist at the U.S. Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division, or WH Division. How are you today, Fidel?
I'm good. Thank you for having me today.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining us. First of all, please explain to our listeners, what is the Wage Hour Division of the U.S. Department of Labor?
So we are a federal civil law enforcement agency under the U.S. Department of Labor, which is a cabinet level department of the U.S. federal government. And our job is to enforce several labor law acts and laws, such as the FLSA, which is Fair Labor Standards Act, that includes the federal minimum wage, overtime, record keeping, child labor requirements, and also the Family Medical Leave Act, as we referred it to, the FMLA. So there's so many federal labor laws that we enforce. I know it's a lot, but I want the public to know that we enforce several labor laws that affects all the workers in our nation.
So does the Wage Hour Division cover all of what you just mentioned, all of it, or do you specialize in the wage hour part of it?
So the Wage and Hour Division has multiple laws, labor laws that we enforce, and we cover all of them.
Okay, yes. Because it's the same Wage Hour Division that covers all of them. There's no like separate divisions for the different categories that different parts, aspects of the labor law that you mentioned.
So there are around 26 agencies, programs under the U.S. Department of Labor. So it's a big umbrella. And such as, for example, EBSA, which stands for Employee Benefits Security Administration, and BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and OSHA. And they all enforce different labor laws as well. And together, we are an organization with diverse functions that carries out our missions from a number of offices and agencies. And that is both important and vital to our country. We all make every effort to collaborate together to achieve our missions and to protect and enhance the welfare of our nation's workforce. So it's a lot. The labor law is just as complicated as, tax law. So we need several agencies under the Department of Labor. And the Wage and Hour Division is just another division under the Department of Labor.
And so how do these various divisions achieve the mission of the U.S. Department of Labor? What is their mission?
So our mission for the Wage and Hour, I can speak for the Wage and Hour, is to promote and achieve compliance with labor standards to protect and enhance the welfare of our nation's workforce. So we collaborate with different agencies under the Department of Labor, and we do referrals. So sometimes somebody calls to get some information about the laws that we enforce, and we don't specifically enforce or have jurisdiction over the issue that the caller, has. So we refer them to the right agency. And so our mission as the Wage and Hour Division, we do not only do the enforcing the laws through our federal investigations, but we educate both employees and employers through our outreach coordination. Our division builds and maintains strong relationships with other federal agencies to foster that communication and better serve our workers and businesses throughout the nation. And we also have like MOUs, which are memorandum of understandings with other federal agencies concerning the various laws that our division enforces. So these partnerships provide data sharing, referrals, like I mentioned earlier, coordinated enforcement, joint outreach, and compliance assistance. And these partnerships with these different agencies under the U.S. Department of Labor, we maximize our impact through corresponding benefits for both businesses and workers alike.
Mhm. Is there any confusion sometimes between different branches of enforcement, different specialties, different divisions?
Yeah, so we get callers all the time, and they're going through a very tough time. They have a situation with their employer, or sometimes the employer calls, and they're looking for information, to some of the concerns that they might have. And when they call, um, they tell us all this, their whole story of what's going on, and we try to tell them, hey, we don't enforce that law, but we can refer you to the right agency. And sometimes they get frustrated because they feel like we're pushing them away, and we're not. We're actually trying to help them out. And so there's the confusion, because the public, both employees and employers, they don't really know who investigates what, and who can give them the right information to their concerns. So that's what we try to do with our compliance assistants when they call our telephone number.
Mhm. And when they call the telephone number, do they usually reach you?
So when I do my outreach presentations, I give them 3 numbers. I always give out 3 numbers. I give out the national number. So if whoever's listening through our virtual presentations, webinars, they can call with any questions or concerns that they might have. And I also give our local district office telephone number, which is the Chicago district office. And I also give my direct cell phone number. So if anybody has questions, they can contact me directly. And so they do. I get calls all the time. I'm pretty sure I'll be missing 10 calls by the end of this interview, so I'll have to return those calls. So I'm always busy.
How does the wage hour division differ from the Illinois Department of Labor?
Well, one of the differences between wage and hour division and those of the local or state agencies like the Illinois Department of Labor is that their activities are generally limited to the jurisdictions they are assigned to. The Illinois Department of Labor, they're limited to just enforcement to businesses in the state only, as opposed to our division, which is nationwide. So we do investigations, including U.S. territories at the Atlantic Islands, and as far as Guam, which is located deep in the Pacific. Also, there are laws that they enforce that we don't enforce, and vice versa. So I also do referrals on the laws that we don't enforce. I refer the callers to call the Illinois Department of Labor.
So is the delineation that when any of these violations cross state lines, then you come in?
Right. So that's when we come in. So generally, folks don't understand that an employer has could have multiple establishments, maybe 2 here in Chicago, 2 in Wisconsin, or Indiana, or anywhere else. So my understanding is that Illinois Department can only enforce the laws within the state of Illinois. So if the employer has established outside the state of Illinois, and they have violations at the establishments here, they can't investigate outside of Illinois. So the difference between us and them, we are able to do so. So if we do an investigation on an employer that has multiple establishments throughout the country, and wherever we start the investigation, we deem we say that this is a systemic issue. So we open investigations on the other establishments just to see compliance.
So even if the non-compliance is in Chicago, it's still under your jurisdiction.
Right.
I see. And then what about when like for instance, the item that the business is using, and then like ingredients or product that are essential for the business, and those practices such as maybe like for chefs, and they're using products that from out of state, and how does that factor into your jurisdiction?
Right. So that's it's when an employee is engaged in interstate commerce.
Mhm.
That covers the employee for us to do an investigation on their behalf, because they're engaged on working with products that cross state lines, interstate commerce, what we call. And for instance, if an employer is not covered under the Fair Labor Standards Act, we are able to enforce the laws for those employees who are engaged in interstate commerce. So yeah.
So if let's say the chef is not getting properly paid, but the server also is not getting properly paid, then would you also help the server as well, or would you just concentrate on the chef, and then the server would have to ask the Illinois Department of Labor for help, or could the server actually come to both of when they complain, could they come to both you, the federal level, and also Illinois, the state level?
So we have two types of coverage jurisdictions. So one is, we hope that when we go in that we have enterprise coverage, meaning we're able to establish that an employer is covered and we can investigate for all the employees of that establishment. And enterprise coverage, the employer has to have make at least $500,000 in gross sales, and have more than 2 employees, full-time employees working at the establishment. And there's other factors that we try to establish that there's enterprise coverage. So when we don't have coverage for all the employees, what we try to establish is individual coverage. And that's by interviewing the employees to see if any of the employees are engaged in interstate commerce, like you mentioned before. And unfortunately, there are some employees, depending on the work that they actually perform, they don't meet those criteria of individual coverage. And unfortunately, we can't enforce or assist them with any violations that the employer might be in. So what we do is we notify those employees who are not covered under our jurisdiction. So we refer them to the state, the Illinois Department of Labor, because the Illinois Department of Labor doesn't have a threshold of how much an employer has to make in order for them to be covered, for them to enforce the local state law.
But your major mission for you is to help employers be compliant, so that it doesn't have to come down to that. So how do you go about with your outreach to employers?
Yeah, so we work with employers by doing outreach. We make every effort to communicate with the chambers of commerce, employer associations, and we offer our services to them, like presentations on how they can be in compliance, and taking questions and concerns during these presentations. Just as an employee calling to file a complaint where their contact information is kept confidential, we do the same with the employers who call and ask questions about their concerns. not only do we offer presentations to the employers from our outreach, but we also try to educate employers during an investigation. So after each investigation, our investigators analyze the information that they gathered during the investigation process, and they present to the employer the findings of the investigation. And the investigator goes over with the employer on what they need to do or change in order to be in compliance with labor laws. Because we don't want to just go in there and do one investigation and you'll never see us again. Normally what we do is we do an investigation, and if we've done many investigations where there's no violation, so we're not always out there trying to find something, if the employer is in compliance, if the employer is in compliance. But for those employers who are not in compliance, we do the investigation, but we also educate them. And because more than likely, we'll be coming back again to check to see if you're in compliance, if you follow the instructions that we gave them. Obviously, we can't tell them how to run their business, but we can let them know that they're not in compliance, so they have to make some changes on how they operate, So, and we're always there. We give them our telephone number, and in many instances, the employers keeps in touch with the investigator who led the investigation. Just calling them, hey, can you help me out? I'm trying to make some changes in my workplace. And the employer is like, okay, so then the investigator will then tell them like, oh, well, let me know what changes you want to make, and I can from there let you know whether or not you'll be in compliance or not, or how you can change it a little bit.
So has the wage hour division always had this outreach, or did something change and then this outreach came into effect?
So the outreach, we always had outreach. We always have. The problem is that the pandemic came and we stopped doing, we stopped going to the establishments to do our investigation. So everything's been done virtually, by telephone, and records via email. And now that we're little by little, we're coming off this pandemic and things are going a little bit to normal, back to normal. Our investigators will be now going to the establishments and doing the investigations, interviewing employees at the establishments. So that's why our outreach is a little bit different right now, because we want to let the employers know, hey, this is what's going on. If you have any questions or concerns, give us a call, and we can help you change the way you operate when it comes to compliance. So therefore, if there was ever an investigator comes to your establishment, you'll be ready and you'll have no worries because you are in compliance with the law.
How effective is your outreach now virtually versus in person? How do both kinds of outreach compare?
Well, in person, it's more personal because they can see you, and folks are more engaged because you're there in front of the audience, giving your presentation, and seeing somebody live encourages the employee or the person, either employee or employer, to ask questions. As opposed to a virtual presentation, you can't see them, and there's no they're so engaged, but it's much different. So when I do presentations in front of a live audience, you sort of sense who wants to ask a question, but they're kind of shy. So you sort of like ask the question for them by pointing out to them, have you ever, give an example? And that's how you get them engaged with the conversation. So I don't just do a presentation by reading off a PowerPoint presentation. I like to just give examples so folks can be familiarized with the information that I'm providing to them.
So when you talked about the employee organizations, how do those employee organizations differ from labor unions? You said that you are in touch with them with your to give presentations, etc.
Right. So I joined different committees as a guest, not as a member. And so usually those are employee organizations who are fighting for these employees' rights. Unions are usually not are part of these committees that I'm familiar with. So all these committees that I'm part of, that I attend to at monthly meetings, quarterly meetings, or yearly meetings, depending on the organization, I've never, I'm speaking for myself, I haven't seen anybody who represented a union. A union, we usually, I get referrals from unions because I do my outreach and I reach out to different unions as well. And so we sort of build a business relationship because the unions out there trying to help their members when there's something going on at work. And when they can fix the problem, then what they do is they refer that employee to us, or the union usually calls us to file a complaint or just to ask questions about their concerns.
So these employee organizations are actually groups of employees in different departments at the employers, right? That's at the business that you visit. Employee organization.
Yeah. So right. Sometimes we so when we do an investigation, one of the questions that we ask the employees is, do you guys have a union? And usually they'll be like, yes, we do. I'm like, do you have a contact information? Because the union has a lot of information about the employees and the members. So we try to get that information that sometimes the employee forgets to let us know during the interviews. And so the unions are very helpful by giving us that information. And it makes the investigation process a little bit easier to move it along rather than, like making it longer than what it's supposed to be.
So what is the most common complaint from employees? Do they usually complain to you, or do they complain to the union first?
I think it varies. I don't ask. So when somebody calls our number or they call me directly, I never ask them, did you talk to your union first? No, one of the first thing I asked them is, okay, tell me your story. And sometimes those calls take anywhere from 30 to an hour long because they start from the beginning and sometimes it's not related to what the information that we're looking for. But I don't ask them about, did you talk to your union first? Or what did your union say? Unless they bring it up, then I'll ask additional questions in regards to the union. And I'll ask for that contact person's information so I can call that person and get more information from them. Because like I said, they usually have more information that the employer forgets to let me know.
Then what about the employees who are not not in a union? How do their complaints? Well, you don't ask them whether or not they're in the union, but eventually you know anyway, right?
Right. So you don't have to be a union member for us to help you with this situation. Our mission as an agency is to help, assist, and enhance the welfare of our nation's workforce. And, yes, employees call our office to file a complaint, but every call that we get from an employee does not result in a complaint being filed. No, so we talk to the employee and go over the situation, and we ask them questions. So from the information that is given to us by the employee, we are able to verify if it's a valid complaint or if the situation, or we have no jurisdiction over the enforcement or no enforcement because of the information that they gave us. So we make every effort to refer them to the right agency, like I said before. So yeah, you don't have to be a union member for you to file a complaint. But for filing a complaint, now that we're in the subject of complaint, just to give everybody listening an idea of who may file a complaint with us, and keep in mind, it's not just for a current employee to file a complaint, but a former employee can file a complaint, a parent or a guardian, school officials, other employers can, and they do file a complaint against another employer, advocacy groups. And finally, other federal law enforcement agencies can file a complaint with us. And they do that by calling the Chicago district office. And I can share that telephone number, 312-789-2992, or calling the nationwide telephone number, 866-487-9243. So no matter where you're calling from, whether you're a union or non-union member employee, your call will be sent over to your local district office closest to you from wherever you're calling. So we get calls from people from California, Hawaii, New York, Florida, Utah, you name it. So, but we transfer over that case over to the local district office.
What are the most common complaints from the employees?
I'm sorry?
What are the most common complaints from the employees?
Well, overtime issues. So for instance, there are employees who get paid not only in cash, they can be paid in check. So they're like, I get paid a flat rate every week. And no matter how many hours I work. And one of the questions that we ask is, do you get paid overtime if you work more than 40 hours? And they're like, no, I get paid a flat rate. No matter if I work 30 hours, 60 hours, or 80 hours. And so I ask them questions about, are they an exempt employee? So it's a long list of questions to try to determine whether or not this employee is actually exempt from overtime. And if they're not, then we take the complaint because there is an overtime issue according to the allegations. So mostly it's the overtime issues that folks called for to file a complaint.
What makes an employee exempt if the explanation is not too long?
Well, see, I'm gonna try to make it short because it is really long, and but it's important for everybody who's listening, both employees and employers. Just because an employer pays an employee of a salary, it does not make that employee exempt from overtime. See, employers always, when we do an investigation, we go into the establishment and we're like, hey, is there anybody you're paying? Is there anybody you're not paying overtime? Oh yeah, like 10 people we're not paying overtime. And why is that? Oh, because I pay them a salary. And I'm like, well, that's not a reason for those employees not to be paid salary. Did you do an exempt test on them? Like ask them questions. Do they supervise anybody? And if so, it has to be at least 2 full-time employees. And they're like, no, they don't supervise anybody, but they get paid a flat salary rate. I'm like, no, that's not good enough. So yeah, that's what, if anything, I want to send that message that just because you pay them a flat salary rate, it doesn't make that employee exempt from overtime.
So what you're saying is that for salaried employees, if they work over 40 hours per week, then they should be entitled to overtime?
Right, so non-exempt employees are entitled to overtime after 40 hours. And another issue that a common issue that we get, calls we get, is that an employee gets paid bi-weekly, so every 2 weeks. And the employer pays overtime after 80 hours, not after 40. And so what they do is the first week, the employee works 60 hours, right? And so, and the following week, so they think by combining 80 hours, as long as they don't go over 80 hours, they're not going to pay them overtime. And that's not necessarily true. If the first week you work 60 hours, and the second week you only work 20 hours, you owe that person 20 hours of overtime for the first week. Obviously, the second week you only work 20 hours, you don't owe them overtime. But if you combine those hours together, it adds up to 80 hours. So the employer thinks because they didn't go over 80 hours, they're not supposed to be paid overtime. And that's not true. According to the Fair Labor Standards Act, every work week stands alone, no matter how you pay your employee, weekly, bi-weekly, semi-monthly, or even monthly. You have to separate every work week. If in those work weeks, they work more than 40 hours and they are non-exempt employees, you owe them a time and a half.
So well, let me give a station ID first. This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM, and we have with us Fidel Arroyo Jr. of the U.S. Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division, WH Division, and he is CORE, which is what is the acronym represent again?
It's the Community Outreach Resource Planning Specialist.
Okay.
It's just a fancy title. That's all it is. I just represent the U.S. Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division. It's just a fancy title.
Okay. So do you mean that a salaried employee, if they work over 40 hours a week because they are exempt in some ways, that could make them exempt and not entitled to overtime? At least there's a possibility of that in some exemptions, right? If they work over 40 hours a week and are salaried.
So let me give you an example of what a salary, an exempt employee is. Somebody who's exempt from overtime. A perfect example is a supervisor. Okay, so a supervisor is somebody who supervises 2 or more full-time employees and has they have discretion of, they can hire, responsibility of hiring and firing employees. They don't necessarily have to fire them, but they have great input in telling like the owner, hey, this person is not working out. We can't have him on because he can't get used to the work. So we need to let him go. And the owner will be like, okay, are you sure? Yeah, that's great input. You don't necessarily have to fire them, but you have input. And also, all the employees that they supervise has to recognize them as their immediate supervisor. So when we interview employees, we're also asking questions about their supervisor because we're trying to establish whether or not the person we previously interviewed who is exempt by, who has been claimed exempt by the employer, we ask, okay, so if you have an issue with work or a problem, who do you talk to or who do you raise those concerns to? And if they tell us, oh, let's say, for example, Fidel is the supervisor. Oh, I go and talk to Fidel because he's my immediate supervisor. So we cross-reference interview statements about other employees just to see, to verify that the employee that the employer is claiming exempt is truly exempt.
And is it that the salaried employees usually make much more than the hourly employees? So that is why sometimes they're exempt, because they're already paid more?
That's not necessarily true all the time, and I'll tell you why. Because let's say somebody gets paid, let's say $1,200, for the sake of argument, right? $1,200 every 2 weeks, right? But they work in total for the 2 weeks. They work, let's say 120 hours, or let's just give it 100 hours. Okay, 100 hours. So you divide 1,200 times the hours that they work, and you get an hourly rate, your regular rate, and that's $12. I divided those two, $1,200 that he gets paid every 2 weeks by the hours that they work, which is 100. And it changes every week because you don't always work the same week. Sometimes you can work. I've had employees working 70 to 80 hours a week. So that's $12. And if you're working in Chicago, you're getting paid a salary, that's below the minimum wage for the Chicago part, you know. So I've calculated that before to some of the employees who are paid salary, and they're like, oh, I'm fine, nothing's wrong with me, I get paid. And I'm like, well, let me just ask you a question. So I tell them how much you make. Like 1,200, let's say 1,200 a week, every 2 weeks, I'm sorry. But how many hours do you work? Oh, I work anywhere 120 hours every 2 weeks. And I'm like, do you realize what your regular rate is after working those many hours? That's $10. So the people that you work with who are being paid hourly, who are getting paid $13 an hour, maybe $15 an hour, you're getting paid $10 an hour when you divide those two numbers. And it blows their mind because they've never calculated that way or never saw it that way. And so, yeah, sometimes it doesn't happen where somebody gets paid a salary that makes more than the person who works or who gets paid hourly.
How important is record keeping for employers?
It's very important. It should be the most important thing for an employer to have. It's their best defense because the law states that the employer must keep and maintain accurate and detailed records, payroll records, including corresponding timesheets. Because when we go in there, we do our investigation, we're also auditing the records. So we look at the payroll summaries and we compare them with the timesheets. So whatever the timesheet says, it has to match what the payroll summaries indicates. And if you don't have that, it's the employee's word over the employer's word. So if the employer doesn't have records, if an employee says, I work 60 hours a week, in reality, they don't. They only work 50, but we don't know because we're not there. We interview this employee, and if that employee says they work 60 hours, and the employer says I pay them for 40 hours, then we're like, then you didn't pay them the extra 20 hours. So now we compute back wages. So then we interview other employees. I mean, it's not just, we don't always just take the employee's word. We have to interview both current and former employees to get all that information. Once we get all those interviews, we analyze them. And from there, if there's violations, we compute back wages. And the employer has to pay for that.
And how difficult is it for you to find former employees? Do they usually, the names come up from the employers or from the employees?
It all depends. It all depends on it depends on the employer, to be honest, because we request from the employer's records, and that's part of record keeping, maintaining current and former employees' contact information. And when we do an investigation, when we start the investigation, we go back 2 years. So any employee that worked during that 2-year period, our investigation period, we're going to contact. And the employer has to provide those requested contact information. And sometimes the employer doesn't give us that information. It only gives us half of those contact informations. But the good thing is that our investigators, they're able to find the former employees, because employees, they become friends. They're not just workers, and they keep their telephone numbers, and they still are friends. They still go out for dinner and friends, and they still hang out. So they still keep in touch with them. And through those employees, that's how we get the contact information. But there's times that we don't, because depending on how big the company is, it's very difficult sometimes. But for the most part, it's not that hard. So that's why we notify the employer, please just it's best that you give us all the information, because regardless whether or not you give us that information, we're going to find out, and we always find out.
When employers ask you questions for help and for compliance, what are the common questions from employers?
The common question is exemptions. I want to pay this employee. I have this employee who I want to pay a salary, and they're going to work. And we ask them questions. Okay, well, what are they going to do? So instead of interviewing the employee, we sort of interview the employer, and we let them. We ask them questions. What exactly is the employee going to do? And they're like, they'll send us this paperwork, this work document, so fancy with all the job description that this employee is going to do. So we ask them, are they really going to be doing that? And they're like, no, they're going to do like 1/3 of what I wrote. Well, it's not, they're not exempt, So it all depends on what the employer says, and it all depends on what the job description, the work they're actually going to perform. But that's the most common one, because they're trying to save money. But at the same time, I want to make sure that I give them the right information, even though it's not the information that they wanted to hear, the answer that they wanted to hear. But I tell them, I want to tell you now, because so you will avoid having an investigation and having to pay back wages if there is an investigation in your company later on.
What about nonprofits, etc.? And you cover all businesses, right? Profits, nonprofits, and what else?
So for the most part, nobody's exempt from labor laws. The only agencies we can't investigate are other federal agencies. But we've investigated local law enforcement, fire departments, jails, post office, transportation, agriculture, you name it. We've investigated them all. So yeah, so it's really hard for us not to have coverage, jurisdiction over an employer for us to do an investigation.
What about religious organizations such as churches?
I can't say personally, I was an investigator for 10 years. I have never investigated an entity connected to the church or any church, but I'm sure there's been investigations before, maybe from another investigator or as another district office. I'm sure there's investigation that has happened. Unfortunately, I mean, not unfortunately, but I can't give that information because I've never had an investigation where I investigated an entity closely related to or connected with a local church. So,
Okay.
but I'm sure there's been investigations like that.
Mm-hmm. Can undocumented employees contact the wage hour division to complain, and will this affect their status?
Absolutely, they can contact us. As a matter of fact, we don't even ask. We don't ask what their status is. So, as long labor laws under the wage and hour covers all U.S. workers. Anybody who works in the United States and their properties or territories is covered under the wage and hour division. Depending, when I say covered, I mean if the employer is covered. If you are covered because of enterprise coverage, coverage overall or individually covered. Those employees we are able to represent for these complaints being filed. And as far as their status, I can't say because everybody's case is different. I mean, I'm not an expert in immigration, but it shouldn't affect them, their status, because it's their right to be represented by the U.S. Department of Labor because they're a U.S. worker.
So for undocumented employees, if the employer has to pay back wages, then that undocumented employee still gets the benefits, still are entitled to those back wages.
The employee is still entitled to those back wages. Obviously, there's a process that our region office handles, not because we're broken up. Washington regional office, and under the regional office, there's district offices. So anything that when it comes to back wage follow-ups or the process, we send that up to the regional office. The regional office is the one who process all that information. And that's one of the questions the employers has. And what we do is we refer them directly to the regional office to handle, because like I said, everybody has a different situation, has a different status, and investigators, they don't handle the back wage part. They provide the employer how much they owe in back wages and how it was calculated. But we have a financial department that handles the back wage process. So that's what we refer them to.
Okay, so what you're saying is that even if employees are undocumented and they complain, or other employees in that establishment complains, and then the undocumented employee is entitled to back wages, they will get their back wages even though they are undocumented.
That's correct, right. Like I said, there is a process for that. We do compute for them, depending on the case. And so there's a process, because I'm sure there are going to be questions. Well, I'm undocumented, how do we process the check? So that's something that the regional office handles. In this case. So yes, to answer your question, we do compute back wages for them, and the employer has to pay the back wages to them as well.
Mhm. Do you have translators for different employees, such as different, because employees, if they want to adequately file their complaint, sometimes they would need to speak in their own language. Do you have adequate translators, at least fluent speakers for the various different languages that might arise?
Yeah, yes, we do. We have many investigators, many not only investigators, but wage hour technicians, office assistants that have that are bilingual in many different languages. And if we don't have somebody in our office, we have a language specialist translator department that are able to provide translation services over 200 languages globally. And so it's very effective. And if we find, because there's different dialects in different countries, even though it's almost the same language, but it's different depending on the region that they came from. That's something that the translation services tries to find out whether or not they can find a translator. But when it comes to that, we schedule the interview at a different time when we find the right translator. that speaks the same language as the person that we want to interview.
Yeah, I for one understand very well the different dialects, because in China, villages sometimes next to each other speak dialect that is like as if the two villages were in separate countries.
Right, and that's where we've run into some problems, because in China there's so many dialects. We're like, oh, they're like, no, and it's kind of hard because there we depend on the employer to translate for us until just to notify the employee that we're going to get back with them once we get the right translator. And we are hoping that the best that the employer is actually cooperating and telling them the information that we're trying to let the employee know. But for the most part, we have the staff who are able to translate for us to do an interview correctly.
Mhm. And how has the wage hour compliance changed, and why?
What do you mean compliance change?
Have compliance among employers has it changed over the years? Are they more compliant now because of better outreach, or has it remained compliance remained about the same over the years?
No, compliance has been pretty good, and it's because not only because of our outreach, but because when the investigator investigates an employer, we let them know the violations that we were able to disclose, and we educate them. So we have what we call the final conference, where we sit down with the employer and present to them the back wages that first the violations that we disclosed, we were able to substantiate, and we also present the back wages that they're supposed to pay to the number of employees, and we go over how we computed those back wages. And so and through that process, the same day, we educate them on how they can avoid that in the future. So we give them examples, we give them forms, fact sheets, opinion letters, just so they can have with them, so they can go over it. And because we can't go through every single information that we gave them, but it's some reading material for them to have. And if there is something that you don't understand, you can always call me. I'm speaking as if I was an investigator investigating them. And they call back. They always call back. I was in the San Antonio district office for a couple years, and I got transferred here to Chicago. And I still have my cell phone number as 210 number, because I still have employers, law firms, CPAs, employees, associations call me with questions. Fidel, how we want to make these changes. What do you think? And so, so that's how we stay in contact with everybody that we come across with, because of outreach, and also because of the investigations.
Also, when the employers, if they haven't paid back wages and it's just not totally intentional or not intentional, do they still get penalties, or are penalties levied when the employers are doing it intentionally?
So when we compute back wages, that's the actual whatever violation is, whether it was minimum wage, overtime, or if it's under the Davis-Bacon, whatever it is, law that we're enforcing, we compute that. And depending on the investigation, if the civil money penalties or liquidated damages applies to that case, we also take into consideration whether we're going to consider it willful, non-willful, or, that's why we ask questions. When we start an investigation, we talk to the employer and we notify them that we open an investigation, but we never let them know why or how the investigation was initiated. Was it something that an employee filed a complaint? Or is it a directed case? What we try to let them know is that there's a possibility if we find violations that civil money penalties will be assessed if it applies to the case. And we ask them at the initial conference meeting, are you part of a chamber of commerce? Are you part of an association? And if so, we would like to know who. Because what we try to do with that information is if we find violations for that investigation, and in the initial conference meeting, they told us, oh, we're part of the association, then we want to contact that association group and let them know, hey, we had an investigation with one of your members, and we don't know if you're possibly giving your members incorrect informations or guidance according to federal labor laws. And if so, we want to help you change that, because we don't want the rest of your members to be not in compliance or following the same industry practices. And so that's something that we do as well. And we hope, we don't go with the idea that we're going to find back wages, and we're not there to, how many civil money penalties we're going to compute or liquidated damages. But yeah, it all depends on the case by case basis when we if we want to say that it's applicable to that investigation, civil money penalties and liquidated damages.
And you mentioned earlier about whether it's a complaint case or a directed case. What is a directed case?
So a directed case it's an initiative. So it all depends. Every year we have directed cases. We plan do our research and to see what industries there might be violations, where violation might be at the highest. So to do my job right, is not only to assist and represent my office, but to reach out to the communities and present them this valuable information. So directed cases, we analyze that information, and the following fiscal year we'll be like, okay, we're going to investigate. There was so many violations under this industry. We're going to continue this initiative the next fiscal year, and we're going to randomly select 50 establishments under the industry. And sometimes we're there. We open an investigation, the employer, how did this come about? I've always paid my employees correctly. And we're like, we never said that we came here based on a complaint, but we can't notify them. We can't tell them why we're there. And I said, but that's the least of the concerns. Whether we came here because of a complaint, whether we came here because of a directed case, we're there. And we're not going to leave until we do the whole investigation, And so that's the difference between a complaint, which is somebody filed a complaint, whether it's employee or employer or a referral from another agency, that's a complaint and a directed. It's just something that we randomly selected because there was a lot of violations on the industry elsewhere, and we're applying that to different district offices.
Can you give us some examples of what industries were selected, were in most violation last year, let's say the other year, last year, and this year, if you can?
So I can't give out too much of that information, but I will give out one of the most common ones. It's restaurants. Restaurants, not paying correctly. You know, the employer, there's always, they're paying cash off the books, straight time for overtime, not paying the correct minimum wage because there's tipped employees, right? So they're paying less than the minimum wage and they're not making enough money in tips to cover the minimum wage. And the employer doesn't keep those records. So the way I see it is that, and the reason why restaurants are always, not always, but for the most part, there's a lot of violations there, is because cooks, right? Cooks, they work at the restaurant, they know the system, they run the kitchen, and sometimes they go on their own and they open their own business and they take the same practice where they worked before to now their new business, thinking that that's the way to do it. And when we go in there and we do an investigation, we let them know, hey, how come you're not paying overtime? How come you're not paying at least a minimum wage when it comes to the tipped employees? And they're like, well, everybody does it. I've worked in 20 restaurants and everybody's done it, So I thought that was fine. And we're like, unfortunately, that's not the way to do it. It's like, how come you don't investigate those restaurants? And we're like, well, right now we're not focused on those restaurants. We're focused on and I understand that this is a practice that you're familiar with, but it's the wrong practice. So yeah, so that's one of the examples.
Mhm. You mentioned earlier that if the tipped employees are not getting enough tips, then because I'm figuring that some of our listeners might be restaurant owners and they might be curious about this, then do they have to adjust their what they pay to their employees? If the tips are not coming in, do they have to adjust right away so that the employees are covered for at least the minimum wage for the hours that they worked? The tipped employees, I mean.
So that's why it's important to keep records. If you keep records the way you're supposed to, then you shouldn't have a problem, because records, it takes 5 minutes to check everybody's status of how many hours they worked, how much tips they made, and the ones who are not in compliance for the most part are those who don't keep records. And how you can't guess how many hours somebody worked the week before or how many tips somebody made the last 2 days. We're human. We're not going to remember everything. We can't even remember what we were 2 weeks ago, on Monday. So it's very hard to keep a record of all the employees that work for you. So when you keep records, you're able to know how many hours the tipped employee worked, how many tips they made, and from there you can see the difference. Oh my God, they didn't make enough tips today because there was not enough customers today. It was a slow day, but yet they still worked 8 hours. And so I have to pay the difference. I got to make a note of that on my records. So when it comes to paying them a check, at the end of the week or bi-weekly, you'll have that, and you'll pay them correctly. And that's one of the issues that we see a lot in the restaurant industry. Employers not keeping records. And another thing too, since we're in the industry, a restaurant industry topic, employers, they sometimes don't pay for all hours work for the tipped employees. If, for instance, an example, if there's not enough traffic coming in, a lot of customers coming in into your business, and you have 6 or 5 servers just standing there, the employer's like, all right, clock out. You're not working. You clock in when when people start coming in. But you can't go anywhere. You wait till the customer gets here. So they clock out for like almost 2 hours every day. And that's compensable time, because now the employee is engaged to wait at your establishment for the employer's benefit. And you have to pay them for that time. And the employer's like, no, they weren't even working. They're on their phone. Who cares? They're at your establishment. They're engaged to wait until, because they're not free to do whatever they want. They have to be there in case a customer comes, so they can attend to them or give them customer service, right? So that's compensable time. So now you own the whole minimum wage. And if it adds up to more than 40 hours a week, you owe them overtime. And that's a typical violation that we see, not only in restaurants, car wash companies. Oh, it's raining, but you can't leave. It's only going to rain for 2 hours. You stay right here. It's going to stop raining. Wait till customers come. And it's in different businesses. And the same thing, the same respond. Oh, well, they're not doing anything. They're just there sitting down, talking, eating food, playing on their phone, but they're still engaged to wait. And that's compensable time.
There was a recent incident with Tank Noodle in Uptown in Chicago, and the employees said that the employees would keep the tips. How are you able to investigate the employees that take tips from the employee? How do you investigate employers who take tips from the employees?
Well, that's one of the questions that we ask when we start an investigation for the restaurant industry. We ask how they operate. We ask, do employees get to keep their tips when the customer pays them or gives them a tip, or do you have a tip pool system where everybody puts in a tip jar, and then and that's how we find out. And that's what the questions that we ask in the interview statements. When we interview the employees, every restaurant has a different way of operating. They're all different, and that's why those interview statements are very important. Not only that, but the initial conference meeting with the employer when the case starts, because we ask them the same questions. And sometimes those answers that the employers gives us is different from what the employees are telling us. And that's why it's important to not only interview the current employees, but the former employees too, because there we can analyze all that information and see, use that as evidence that is overwhelming, that is their word against the employers. If you have 100 employees and 95 are saying the same thing, different to what the employer said, and then you don't have any records, or the records are not accurate. You have records, but they're not accurate. It's like I said, if you don't have accurate and detailed records, then it's their word against yours as an employer.
Okay. So let's do WZRD community assessment with you. WZRD Chicago, being a nonprofit radio station, must be responsible to the community we serve. WZRD is mandated to file quarterly issues with the FCC on non-entertainment community-focused programming. We like to assess the community for these quarterly issue topics with 3 questions. First, what is most important to you?
Oh, wow. uh, to do my job right, to not only assist and represent my office uh, correctly, but to reach out to all our communities and present them this valuable information that I'm sharing with your listeners that I think will be beneficial to them. As many as you already know, our department will never have enough investigators to investigate, examine every business. So it's also my job to prioritize and direct resources to where the data and evidence from our neighborhoods, our investigations show the problems are largest. So it's important for me to maintain and coordinate relationships with community organizations that represent both the employees and employers alike.
What long-term problem must we address?
Long-term problem. I feel like that the public should know that we as an agency can't do it alone. We need the public's help. If the information that I provide to them through presentations, radio, television, or even virtual webinars is affecting them or someone that they know, call us. You don't have to file a complaint when you call us. You can simply get answers to your questions or concerns. And after that, you can decide whether or not you want to file a complaint. So basically, we need everyone's help as a long-term solution.
What problem must be resolved now?
Like I said, we need everyone's help. As America emerges from this global pandemic, we want to ensure that the public knows that the Wage and Hour Division is focused on protecting the workforce and supporting essential workers who continue to keep moving us forward. We have to continue reaching out to all our essential workers. The value of the workers who have remained on the job despite any dangers to themselves to serve the greater good to ensure that the American economy continues to forge ahead has never been more clear to us. So it's very important that we educate our essential workers about their essential protections. And at the same time, reach out to the employers to assist them and notify them about their responsibilities as an employer and help them stay in compliance. And that's what we need to do now. And that's what we're trying to do.
Mhm. Yes, you seem to have your work cut out for you because there seems to be so much to do. How does your division, the size of the division, compare with other divisions in the U.S. Department of Labor? Let's put it more easily. What is the largest division in like the top 3 largest division, if you have that information on hand?
Under the U.S. Department of Labor?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I would say just on top of my head, and I don't mean to disrespect any of the other agencies who are my colleagues, but I think the Wage and Hour Division is one of them. OSHA is another, and EBSA, EBSA, and that's the Employment Benefits Security Administration. Yeah, I think those are the top 3 that comes on, on top of my head as far as the biggest agencies under the U.S. Department of Labor.
Okay, and employee benefits. So that's like insurance and retirement benefits.
That's correct, and I believe COBRA, 401k, I guess health care insurance,
Mhm.
benefits that you see on your check that gets deducted. I would think, I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on EPSA, but from a little that I know, it's a vital. Their mission, everybody's mission under the U.S. Department of Labor is just as vital as ours. Everybody has a big part that that affects every worker, every employer in the United States. And it's important for both to try to get that information. It's, you can, just to give you an idea, the reason it's very important for me to promote who we are, and not just for the workers, but for the employers, because we want the employers to be in compliance. We don't like computing back wages. We don't like, it's like a big bill that you have to pay in a lump sum when you should have paid correctly every week instead of paying in one lump sum with our investigations. And the possibility of assessing civil money penalties on top of that and liquidated damages it's not a good thing for us to present to an employer. We know you guys are struggling, and just to give you an idea, and this is not to scare them off, but this is to raise awareness of how serious an investigation from the Wage and Hour Division is. So just to share some statistics to your listeners, we as a division, we've helped over 1.3 million workers in the past 5 years. That's more than the entire populations of Las Vegas, Orlando, Florida, Cincinnati, Ohio combined. And on top of that, we've recovered more than $1.4 billion in back wages in the past 5 years. That's a lot of money. And we hope those who are listening, if they're employers, that if you have any questions, not just employers, but employees too, we represent both. We want a fair level of playing field for all employers, and we want the employees to be paid correctly. You can visit our website. If you don't want to call me because you're scared that I'm going to target you for an investigation, that's okay, but that's not what I'm here to do. I'm here to sincerely help both employers and employees, even if it's confidential. You don't have to give us your information. You can visit our website at www.dol.gov, which is gov, /WHD, which is Wage Hour Division. Or you can call our nationwide office telephone number, 866-487-9243. Or you can call our district office here in Chicago at 312-789-2992. Or you can call me directly at area code 210-885-6897.
Fidel, could you repeat all the information from the website again, one more time for our listeners?
Absolutely. Our website is www.dol.gov/WHD. And that is, there's a section for employers that gives you resources for employers, interpretive guidance, forms, posters that you need to post. That's part of compliance, that you keep labor law posters. You can print them for free from our website. there's compliance assistance, there's industry-specific resources, there's fact sheets, labor laws, our regulations book, which is the CFR Code of Federal Regulations. It's very complicated, but the Wage and Hour Division has made it into fact sheets for the public to understand. And there's also new and small businesses resources that you can click on and get information from. So there's so much information out there at our website if you don't want to give us a call. But I encourage everybody here, all your listeners, to give us a call about any questions or concerns that they might have. We're here to help. Honestly, we are here to help. You
And give
call
us
if you don't.
the telephone numbers again. Yeah, please repeat the telephone numbers again.
Okay, the telephone numbers.
Mhm, all
So
three.
the nation,
Mhm, all
all
three.
across, 866-487-9243. For the Chicago district office, 312-789-2992. And to call me directly, 210-885-6897.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Fidel Arroyo Jr. of Wage Hour Division with the U.S. Department of Labor for sharing your insight on wage and hour compliance with our WZRD Chicago listeners.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM.